let me say something about the topic of today's discussion, and then I'll move to present the panel and a little bit how we're going to run this event. First of all, my name is Marta Foresti. I work at ODI, the Overseas Development Institute in London, where I'm the director of the Human Mobility Initiative. And ODI, for those of you who don't know, is a UK-based think tank that mostly works on issues of international development and humanitarian affairs. And in the last few years, we've made a very deliberate effort to try to engage much more on the broad issues related to human mobility to make sure that they can be central to future conversations about economic and social development in ways that we felt were terribly overlooked in much development conversation up to fairly recently. So I just thought I'll share with you a couple of thoughts of where we got to with this conversation around migration and development, or rather migration for development, and I'll try to put to you in a minute. At the moment, it feels to me that we are at a really important crossroad, having done, I think, very important preparatory work, having generated a certain amount of interest. We now have an opportunity with the implementation of the Global Compact to really move to action and to make some real concrete step forwards. The 2 years of consultation and then negotiations of the Global Compact have seen a number of references and conversations about the importance of development, the centrality, and the text of the Global Compact has a number of references to the word development, to the Agenda 2030, to issues around economic productivity, social inclusion, and so on and so forth. I think, and that of course builds on many, many years of research and engagement at a country level, mostly I think from development economists that for some time have been saying, watch out, you know, the fact that people move has potentially an incredibly beneficial effect on development outcomes. And yet, for some reason, as a colleague of mine told me at the beginning of this journey, we've been very timid in the development sector to really pick up this potential and do something about it. Possibly for the reason that there is something inherently a bit difficult about the fact that if you try to make effort to develop a country, a city, a territory, a community, or help people to find opportunities and then people move, well, maybe something has gone wrong. Whereas as we've learned through research and evidence, that's not quite the way it works. And indeed, migration can be a very powerful, positive strategy to achieve development outcomes. Doesn't mean that happens automatically, and that, as we have found out, is a matter of policy options and choices, and we'll hear more about it. But the reality that the fact that people move can be an option to achieve development outcomes is something where I think we've got to some, if not some consensus, certainly some understanding that I think is upon all of us to take forward in very concrete ways. It is also the case that despite this conversation happening, it's still pretty difficult to get issues of migration and human mobility more broadly onto the agenda of much development agencies or much development debates. COP has been mentioned a few times in the last couple of days while we are here. The climate community is discussing climate change in Poland, and it feels that although we are all clear about the fact that more ought to be done about the relationship between climate and migration, it's still quite difficult to make those relationships come alive. So what I'm hoping to do today is to take this conversation a step forward. We are recording this event so that through the channels of ODI that reach out quite broadly to the development community, we can use it also to find practical ways forward in the near future. So with that in mind, and with this idea of moving on to this concept that migration can be a strategy to achieve development outcomes, what we'll do today is the following. First, we will ask some of the key institutions in the migration development space to share with us what they're going to do, what they're doing, what they're going to do, and to what extent both the process of the Global Compact, but also the realities of the political visibility of migration means for their plans in the near future. We're then going to get some concrete ideas on how that can be achieved, both in terms of financing and in terms of innovative proposals and design. And then we're going to get the reactions from some member states to get a sense about how that sounds, particularly within very specific and sometimes quite tough political context where these words need to be taken forward. And then we'll have a broader discussion with all of you, with us, with the panel, and amongst ourselves. So if that sounds good enough and you're going to stay with us until the end, let me introduce my first speaker, who is Laura Thompson, who is the Deputy Director General of IOM. And I think obviously IOM, with the Global Compact and with its recent inclusion in the UN family, has, I think, a pretty unique and unprecedented opportunity to make great strides on these agendas. So we look forward to hear from you, Laura, on what's going to come next on migration for development in IOM.
Thank you very much, Marta, and it's a pleasure to be here with all of you and with all the panelists here. A great opportunity to also show how we can partner in this subject with a variety of institutions. So let me start by saying that I think the day before we adopt the Global Compact, we must not forget that the potential of human mobility to contribute to development outcomes is huge. And we are starting from that point of view. So migration can be either a development strategy for some people because they don't have the possibilities of staying at home, but also it can be a development outcome. And I think through this presentation, I will take you through how these concepts have evolved through the time. Migrants can move because of the choice that they have to improve their livelihoods, meet economic and social aspirations, and they bring benefits to their new communities in the form of skills, strengthening the labor force of the governments of destination, investment, very often in both directions, and obviously cultural diversity that more and more is appreciated now as an important element for societies, despite the negative comments that we see very often. Migrants can also obviously play a very important role in improving the lives of the communities in their countries of origin through the transfers of skills, of financial resources, and we have Dilip here that is the guru of remittances, so contributing to the development outcomes also of the countries of origin. But we are clear that in order to get all these, we need to have a well-managed migration in order to get these benefits. And that the right policies, and I would say regulations, are in place to really maximize and facilitate the positive outcomes that migration can have for everybody, first of all, for the migrants themselves, but also for the countries of origin and destination. I think we, at IOM, we have contributed through the years to the global debate on migration and development and the complex relationship that it has. Particularly, I would say two fora that have been important, the high-level dialogue on migration and the Global Forum on Migration and Development that we just had the last 3 days. And our basically work was around traditional migration and development thematic areas. Remittances, diaspora engagement, return of qualified nationals, and this is what a lot of our programming was about. And I think it has really facilitated a much better understanding of the potential linkages between development and migration, but it has been basically on economic terms. In the last years, I would say that it has broadened to social and cultural capitals, the capital that migrants can bring to the countries of origin and destination. But I think importantly, in the last years, there have been a shift in the policy dialogue. The explicit integration of migration, obviously, into the 2030 agenda has been, I would say, the most important milestone and calls for a much more coherent and comprehensive approach. And let me just say that I joined IOM 9.5 years ago. And when I joined IOM, one of the questions that I ask is, why migration was not included into the Millennium Development Objectives. And what I was told was quite interesting. I was told that in the 2000s, when they were negotiated, people saw migration as an issue of human rights. And as a result of that, because human rights were not integrated into the objectives of development of the millennium, migration also was not integrated. And the majority of the people saw migration as a result of lack of development rather than as an enabler of development. And that is why I think it is extremely important to see how this policy debate has shifted, because now I would say nobody puts into question that there is a very strong link between migration and development, and that that link, if we facilitate and create the right conditions, can be bringing a lot of benefits for everybody. So I think what we have seen in the last years, and particularly with that recognition and the fact that migration was incorporated into the 2030 agenda, and not only as an objective itself, but is a cross-cutting objective, particularly if we don't want to leave anyone behind, is that we need really a better understanding of how different governance areas are interrelated and in a certain way impacted by migration, and to what extent other sectoral policies in areas such as health or education or other, can facilitate or impede or put barriers to migrants' ability to really contribute to the societies. And I think, obviously, the anchoring on the GCM and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development also creates an enormous opportunity for all of us to try to leverage as much as we can the impact of migration on the achievement of the SDGs. And many SDGs targets will only be achieved, really, if migrants and migration are considered, but particularly the core objective of the Sustainable Development Agenda, that is not leaving no one behind. So basically, what we decided in IOM is basically to do our own homework, no? Because, again, we have to look at the whole issue of development totally differently. So we are defining our own strategic vision on migration and sustainable development to respond to these opportunities and to create, I would say, a policy framework behind it that can inform all our programming. What we are trying to get is a whole of organization type of approach to have more comprehensively integrated migration and development policy into all our programming, and seeing how this programming can bring also the implementation of the 2030 agenda and respond to these issues. So what we are basically looking is at 4 strategies, that a vision that has 4 strategies. First of all, establishing an IOM as a global thought leader on migration and development by improving our own data and the data that we can provide to all of you, build on evidence-based, and facilitating knowledge sharing between different actors. And I think that the Global Compact and the network that we have created within the UN, or that we are going to be creating now, is an excellent opportunity to also put the data of different organizations together. The second element will be strengthening cooperation between migration and development actors to improve policy coherence and build meaningful partnerships within and outside the organization. And this is a very important element, because what I have seen, at least, and I think this is one of the biggest challenges, is that when we talk, for example, in the Global Forum on Migration and Development, what we have is the majority of the people that deal with migration. We don't have the development people, or very few of them. And it has been through the years that we have, when we do the dialogue on international migration, it's also the people of migration. When you go to the things that they are talking development, the people of migration are not there. So how do we bring these 2 communities together in a manner that really start, creating this cross-cutting type of discourse. I'm not talking about panelists, because we do that selection very often very well. I'm talking about the public and the people and the representatives of the government that are here, and very often they are from ministers of interior or ministers in charge of migration, but they don't have to do with planning or development. The third element is building, obviously, our own capacity and the capacity of our own partners to integrate migration in the planning, implementation, and monitoring and reporting of the 2030 development agenda. And the last one is demonstrating through effective programming on the ground the positive relationship between migration and sustainable development. I was just before in a panel about entrepreneurship, and I see that there are still a lot of people questioning that thing. So I really think that these partnerships are going to be fundamental, and I'm really happy that we were invited to this panel, because I think that all these people here and the ones that are going to speak after do have a role, an important role in this, and we really want to say that we're in IOM very happy to partner with all of you to continue doing this, particularly with the World Bank, that we know that you have a very important role in all this in the future. I think to conclude that this Global Compact offers us a great opportunity, and we should not miss it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laura. Laura needs to leave very soon. But I don't want to miss the opportunity, because we actually happen to have in the room a couple of development agencies. So I wonder whether, before Laura leaves, whether can stay a bit longer. Okay, perfect. So we leave, and so development agents, keep your questions for a minute. So let me move then on. This is actually working very well, because then I can move on to Pierre Heilbronn, who is the Vice President of the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development. Now, as Laura said, it has been easier said than done to get the conversation going amongst, migration and development agencies, development communities. And actually, there is obviously a great role that the World Bank plays, but the regional development bank and the investment banks are not been as involved in the conversation. So I'm very glad to have Pierre with us today. Pierre and I began a conversation a few months ago about why I thought it was really important for the EBRD to consider issues of migration. So Pierre, do you want to tell us, from your perspective, what plans are in EBRD in relation to human mobility issues and how you see them related also to the implementation of the Global Compact? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marta, and thank you for inviting EBRD to this event, because, as was mentioned before, the holistic approach, bringing together people who deal with migration specialists and development practitioners, is not that common. And it's fundamental if we want to be more efficient in tackling the root causes of migration, but also all the economic, social, political dimension of human mobility. By the way, it's a challenge also for development banks, because it is a little bit an unknown territory for many of at least of bankers who populate EBRD, who have not looked at their job as linked to human mobility from the outset. So it's also opening eyes on sometimes things which we've been doing without knowing that it was related to human mobility, and sometimes looking at how we can structure a more grounded approach to human mobility and its impact on development. Let me maybe start quickly by underlining both the challenges and opportunities for private investment and financing linked to migration, because this is probably, at least from an institution like EBRD, like development banks, probably the first piece to have in mind, which should be grounded on objective data. One of the key concerns of investors is the availability of skilled workforce. if talent is scarce, for instance, due to outward migration, countries miss out on private investment that would have otherwise supported the economic prosperity and growth. And I encourage you, if you have a little bit of time, to look at the transition report, the flagship report we publish every year, which has been published 3 weeks ago under the leadership of our chief economist, which is called Work in Transition, which is really looking at that, the impact of human mobility on development and this relationship. And it shows, for example, very interesting analytical results that show, for example, that the total factor productivity of firms whose workers have had increased opportunities to emigrate following, for example, the country's accession to the European Union has on average been significantly lower than what it would have been if in the absence of migration. So it showed that there are challenges, and clearly there are challenges on productivity, high employment, high employee turnover not only affects direct productivity, it is also very costly for firms. It can affect profit and make it difficult to ensure continuity of knowledge. All that is very important for private investment and financing, and we see that through our clients every day. But migration, and that's probably what I want to leave with you, can have very positive effects. And we know what has been mentioned, that it facilitates trade, innovation, knowledge sharing, diaspora communities, and since we have the guru of remittances, I'm sure we'll come back to that, is a very important dimension of all that. And there also our transition report has looked at, for example, the impact that emigration has on innovation and more specifically patenting activity. And it is quite interesting because you see that cross-border patent station between new EU member states and EU 15 countries increased significantly after the introduction of free movement of labor. 3 or 4 years afterwards, you see, you can observe this convergence, which show that migration and emigration can have a very positive element through knowledge remittances, if you want. And that probably has to be kept in mind when we talk very often about brain drain. At least this dimension is as important as the negative effect of brain drain. All the issues that benefits and risks are not equally shared by the different countries, players, and there also it's quite interesting to see that productivity losses linked to emigration do not appear, for example, for firms which are foreign owned or companies which are especially in innovative sectors, which show that they are able to adjust to the changing environment, probably by increasing wages. And that leads, obviously, to the question, Marta, you mentioned at the beginning. What are the conditions we should create, or in different countries where we operate, so that migration is an asset and not a problem? And it's exactly what we've tried to develop, and I will be brief on that, but by supporting firms dealing with increased employee turnover and helping them mitigate the adverse effect of immigration. And we do that with our mandate, which is, as you know, very much focused on private sector. And by supporting our clients in addressing very key operational challenges, which are linked to finding and retaining talents in where they invest, enhancing workforce diversity or accessing new markets or target groups, and opening up access to jobs and skills in these markets. And we do that both through the lens of projects, because we are obviously financing projects, but we are also a policy actor. And that means that we cover a range of sectors through our investments, but we also work with national governments, with Ministry of Education, Ministry of Labor, for example, improving national skills standard or apprenticeship models, which I suppose my neighbor will come back to, because vocational training is also a very important element if we want to create the sustainable conditions for our companies where we in which we invest, to have a labor force which is skilled, sometimes in remote regions. Today we've invested something like 5.4 billion euros in projects which have an inclusive dimension. And just earlier this week in Cairo, we signed a youth employment and entrepreneurship program, which will support the capacity of SMEs first in Egypt, but will expand that to Morocco and Tunisia, to deal with and to retain young talents in these SMEs. So that's a very practical example. Just to conclude, what is and it was a question about the role of the Global Compact for migration and the role of multilateral development banks. I've indirectly answered through what we are doing, but and maybe in the discussion I can give you more example. But I think just to conclude, the collaboration between MDBs, among MDBs, is also very important beyond what we do, each of us. We have a contribution and we want to scale up this contribution. One of the great assets of the MDB platform on economic migration and forced displacement, I see fans and great supporters of this work. We've been very much involved as EBRD with the World Bank and other colleagues, is also not only to compete, because institutions always like to compete and to say that they are the migration bank, the refugee bank, or but to map also what we are doing best or better, and to be complementary in our intervention. We clearly do not cover everything which is linked to migration, but we cover this link between job creation in the private sector and the condition which makes investment in these companies and these regions necessary. So identifying gaps in the intervention of multilateral development banks is very important, also so that together we are better placed in tackling the challenge. And it's really the philosophy also behind the compact on global compact on migration, looking at the world as a complex world where there are a lot of stakeholders, and we have to look at the different angles we can bring together to tackle the challenge and also harness the opportunities of migration.
Thank you, Pierre. I'm very, very glad that you are on this panel for a number of reasons. You are reminded us at the beginning not to forget that there is a very basic issues here of lack of familiarity in different professional communities that have simply not, considered some of those issues thus far. But also that once you go beyond, if you want, the titles or the in a way, the slogan around migration and development, and begin to really dig deeper into what it means, for example, from an investment perspective and the role of the private sectors, how many more ideas can come to the fore. I lost count of how many times I've heard during the negotiations of the compact lamenting the lack of the presence of the private sector at the table, and having an organization like BRD that days in and days out work with investors to mitigate their fears, but also to encourage their investment, gives us a very good sense of practical ways that of what can be done with this respect. Shall we carry on? Okay, we'll carry on. Let me then move to, been introduced as the guru of remittances from now on. Who also happens to work at the World Bank, and of course, Dilip Rata is also the head of the Nomad sort of indicators group. So Dilip, share with us the latest on what we know now that you've studied remittances so closely. Tell us what's the latest on their developmental impact, but also more broadly how the bank is making the most of these renewed opportunities to really invest and work on migration for development, including at the country level. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha, and thank you, Laura and Mr. Heilbron. I'll talk more about migration than remittances, but just to point to a new report we released actually at a side event yesterday at, I think, 6 o'clock yesterday, in the room across, where we pointed out the latest remittance data. 2018 remittances are expected to reach $528 billion, and that's a growth rate of 11%. That's only officially recorded data. So I'll leave you on that with that number. But let me first make a remark that migration and development are not separable. And that is why World Bank, even though has not focused on migration for a long time, and that is because of its focus on country-based programming, taking borders as sacrosanct. World Bank and the UN has to work with member states, and that is where international issues sometimes get relegated to the background. That is not an accident that MDGs, Millennium Development Goals, did not address migration, and it is really a happy occasion for all of us that we are in the process of beginning to implement sustainable development goals that includes at least 3 major migration-related goals. Actually, if you count, there will be about 20 odd indicators out of 165 or 169 indicators that are there. So with that remark that migration is intimately linked to development, let me elaborate a bit on that. Unless an economy is completely stagnant, flat, if there is either growth or decline, some sectors must grow faster than others, and that would mean people have to move places. That is as intimate as it gets about migration and development. When the borders are small, people have to move across, and borders cause a lot of difficulties, and they have genuine costs, financial costs, human costs, and Michael has done wonderful work on that, pointing out the border effects in terms of income losses. So with that comment, migration is intimately linked to development. What is the World Bank doing? First, I'm going to do a bit of a laundry list. Hopefully it is not too chaotic. It is, we did a board paper almost 2 years ago, now, actually 2 years now, where we pointed out that the role of an institution like the World Bank Group in the area of migration could be of 4 kinds. First, financing programs that have either migration component or migration is implied with development component, so finance programs. Second, address fundamental drivers for migration. I use the word fundamental drivers, not root causes. Root causes are for bad things. Fundamental drivers are essentially there, like air or like water. So addressing fundamental drivers, it would include a number of things. I'll mention a couple of them. The third is to maximize the developmental benefits of migration in line with the Sustainable Development Goals. And there you have remittances, you have recruitment costs, and you have skill facilitation, skill upgrading, skill certification in destination countries, and also skill certification or recognition of degrees in the home countries. The focus of the World Bank work will be, it has not been, will be in the future on skill certification of low-skilled migrants and skill upgrading of low-skilled migrants. For an institution interested in reducing poverty, you cannot escape addressing issues that affect the poor and the low-skilled. And if we can certify, let's say, a plumber in Dubai, a hotel worker in Morocco has been working for so long and does not have a certification saying this person now is not a starting cook, but actually now that person is a real chef, maybe level 3. A plumber is not just a starting plumber, but maybe now level 4. That kind of certification will give mobility. Also, perhaps when they return, if they return, then they also can carry some of their gains in human capital to monetize it. So that would be one of the important components in terms of skill work with low-skilled migrants. One important issue, and that is where we are doing a lot of work on migration-related SDGs, is this whole issue of recruitment costs. A Bangladeshi worker might pay $5,000 for a job as a construction worker in Abu Dhabi. For that job, the annual income is less than $2,000 per year. We have data to show that Pakistani workers in Saudi Arabia earning about $200 a month pay up to 36 months, 70 months sometimes of expected incomes in labor agent fees just for getting that job. That is all illegal. That is modern day slavery. And that has to be reduced. I'm happy to note that there is the goal of SDG indicator 10.7.1 to reduce recruitment cost. With ILO, we are working closely. We have done surveys in about 30 corridors now to reduce recruitment costs. That has a connotation. Recruitment fees, because migration is legal, but there is too much demand, then getting the visa becomes illegal, meaning if there are 100 visas and there are 1,000 people applying for it, labor agents collect rent. That is why recruitment fees are so high. There is that parallel in corridors where migration is not legal. That fee is paid to smugglers, coyote fees. If you can get a handle on recruitment business and begin to understand that process, you might get something on smugglers, right? So there is that work on recruitment costs that is in SDG. We are working closely on that with ILO, I must mention. On remittances, we are working to reduce remittance costs. Also, there is a interesting SDG in the means of implementation of SDGs, basically to raise financing for development, where they have mentioned goal or indicator 17.3.2 on increasing the volume of remittances. I don't know if that is good or bad. It's clearly a way of confusing aid efforts with efforts on remittances, sort of believing that remittances are a substitute for aid. Remittances are private money. They are not a substitute for public finance. They should not be used for public purposes. That said, diaspora resources are huge. There are 8 channels of link. We heard a couple of them already. You know about remittances, you know about investments, you know about skills, you know about tourism, you know about technology transfer, you know about value. I probably missed one, tourism. Trade and tourism. So there are many links. Lost the chain of my thinking there. So coming back to I really lost the chain of my thinking, counting the numbers. Just to say that, so we talked about 4 roles for the World Bank, and in that we have now gone into proposing that we do migration, when World Bank does systematic country diagnostics and country partnership strategies, to view that with a migration lens. So that is the future. And in the IDA 18 as well as IDA 19, our concessional financing window, we are beginning to look at applying migration diagnostics in countries where migration is important, whether it is diaspora is important, whether remittances are important, whether there is skill shortage or some brain drain aspect in some sectors or in the whole country. Going forward, what are we going to do? First of all, NOMAD, the Global Knowledge Partnership on Migration and Development, is moving into the second phase. So there'll be another 5 years of that program, and we want to hopefully We are hoping to expand it, maybe make it much larger, for providing an inclusive and multidisciplinary, emphasis being on multidisciplinary knowledge initiative for making evidence-based policy. That would be one way we can help the Global Compact on migration. That is on the knowledge front. And then in terms of actual strategic work and operational work in the World Bank, we would be moving more towards operations away from knowledge. So data work, knowledge work will continue, but we will also go into actual operations, and we will work with EBRD and other organizations and IOM in doing that. In terms of specific elements, one is the forward-looking migration profile. This is important because if I had time, I would have explained, but I will rush through it, basically to say that I think that the pressures are there, demographic pressures and otherwise economic pressures, for migration stock to double or triple in the next 20 years. And we need to really begin to think about what the migration picture might look like in a country context to avoid or to manage large and rapid movements. So that would be a significant component of World Bank Group work. Migration-related SDGs, we will continue to work on that. And then maximizing finance for development. And I will end with that particular comment. Actually, I should say something more before that. It's about the Global Compact on Migration. Yesterday's report, and in a blog about a month ago, I proposed that the Global Compact on Migration, one way to begin implementation would be to develop a systematic review framework. You can look up my blog on that one. I wouldn't, in the interest of time, elaborate on that. But let me end by saying that we are also looking into how to harness diaspora resources for innovative financing for development, or what the World Bank is beginning to call now, maximizing finance for development. Remittances 3 times larger than official aid and all that. There is some talk about that, so you know that. That is private money. But if you are able to save remittance costs, which is about 9%, as opposed to the SDG target of 3%, then you are talking about reducing remittance costs by 4%, applied to the volume of 528 billion. You have about 20 billion in saving in the hands of poor people. Recruitment cost reduction can be another $20 billion. And then if you look at diaspora savings, which is about $500 billion a year, if you are able to mobilize even 1/10 of that for financing for development through bond issuances, that amount would be about $50 billion. So you are, on top of that, there is a philanthropic contributions. I have no idea about that money. So that is an idea for a $100 billion financing idea. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm sorry to rush you, but I do know that Laura needs to leave in a minute. So Michael, I'll come back to you in a second. But I first want to give the opportunity to the audience, particularly maybe to some of our member states, if they have questions or comments on what we've heard from the panel, and particularly from Laura now, because she needs to join an event, and I think Dilip soon also will need to leave. So why don't you give me an initial set of reactions from member states, specifically in relation to IOM and the bank. Deidre, please. So Helen, can we pass the mic? And if there is anything we can do to get some air in this room, it would be lovely, because for some reason during the GFMD was freezing and it's really hot. So if there is no... So let me also, with this opportunity to introduce Deidre Kent, who is the Director General of International Cooperation at the Canadian, it's not a Minister of Foreign Affairs, but it's Global Canada.
Global Affairs
GAC.
Canada.
I know it's GAC, is the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Canada.
Well, really thrilled to be here, and congratulations to the panel for highlighting. There, maybe you can hear me better that way. What the panel is really bringing the questions of evidence and engagement, I think, here, and maybe it's an important byproduct of the Global Compact on migration. The negotiations is breaking down those silos that we're not just talking about migration agencies, but bringing in the banks, bringing in donor agencies, and from our perspective, really important to the point about the private sector, but also civil society and different levels of government need to be about this conversation. So, as was pointed out, the 2030 agenda makes an important point about the contribution of international migration to development, and that's been Canada's experience. It has certainly contributed in a very positive way to our development in terms of not just economic, but diversity and culture, etc. So really, I guess just to say, as a member of the EBRD and the World Bank, maybe to point to how member countries don't, and but I mean as a donor, as an actual board member of the banks, we're really pleased to hear what you're saying about reinvigorating and looking at how you're going to be supporting development through migration, and we'll hear from Michael and others. And the financing of the SDGs is a critical part of that, and Canada's working really hard on efforts to bring in the private sector, bring in philanthropists, pension funds, those that need to see the benefits of migration. And perhaps a critical part of this is the fact that most migration is regular, and how can we collaborate to take forward the lessons learned from regular migration, and that's where the greatest development benefits are going to be. We've had a long history with other donors like DFID in the humanitarian space, the forced displacement. So let's look at that regular pathway and bringing in different types of partners and innovative ideas.
Thank you. Paul, and then Evan, if you want. Paul, who is head of the migration team at DFID, the Department of International Development in UK government.
Okay, thanks very much, and thank you to the panel. I'll keep my remarks very brief. Just a few things. What you say about the migration community and the development community really resonates. And I would point out actually that in the UK, it is us, DFID, who lead the UK government engagement in the compact. So whilst it has been quite a neglected area in our work, frankly, migration, and it obviously got a lot of focus and impetus from the humanitarian situation, particularly in the Mediterranean. Our strategy now is to move it away from that sort of security debate. We have a really important role still to play on protection and on vulnerability, of course, but it is, and I think the compact provides a fantastic opportunity for us now to look at the issues that you are describing. So I think the first thing to say very quickly is we're really looking to the IOM to drive this. It's a fantastic moment in time for IOM, I think, as well. The compact and the new leadership, I think, we will be looking to the IOM and looking to support the IOM in really mainstreaming development in the migration work. We will also look to the international financing institutions, where we, like Canada, play a strong role. And I had some questions about capital and about how we can use remittances not just for consumption but for productive investment. So Dilip, you've highlighted that as well. Two very quick questions that I wanted to put to you. One of the themes of the Global Forum, which we've all been at over the last few days, has been ensuring that there are a wide range of voices in the room when we think about migration, and the compact takes a 360-degree look at migration. And I wonder, a challenge for the forum, I think, is to make sure that all those voices are really represented, including those who feel threatened by migration and who see it as a risk. So the question is, how can the growth that migration could potentially generate be genuinely inclusive and bring wider benefits to everyone, both the migrants themselves, the migrant community, but also those people who are, if you like, amongst the communities who receive migration, so that inclusive. And secondly, it seems to me that there is a lot of the work that we're doing at the moment on productive migration is coming out of the kind of humanitarian conflict, protracted crisis space. As we emerge from that, a lot of the initiatives we're supporting are around creating jobs for people who are in protracted crisis situations and the communities. And I think there's there's something about the conflict as a driver and as a driver of migration that I think we need to not lose sight of as we move forward. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Paul. And I mean, very important. If you want, and Evan, if you've got some comments, Evan is the ambassador in Geneva to the UN for the Philippines. Really important to know that DIF in the UK is looking to not just support IOM, but also use in ways. I think his expertise, his power, his long-standing sort of role in the development landscape to really support IOM and the migration community to see development genuinely mainstreamed. And also for reminding us that these efforts around making, around conflict and fragility and the importance of providing jobs and opportunities to those who flee should really be allied with the broader, with the broader understanding and requirement that we just heard from Pierre about the reality of the, skills gaps, market needs. We find a way to create, forge better alliances in the narrow political space that we've got, rather than ending up having unhelpful, siloed, almost campaigns on some of those issues. Evan, and then Laura will give you a chance to say something, and finally flee.
Thank you very much. Not so much comments as perspectives. First of all, there's nothing particularly unique about having to combine migration with development. If you've been following the multilateral scene for some time, you will notice that there have been a lot of shotgun marriages, DRR and migration, DRR and climate change and development, etc., etc., etc. So gradually, by force of necessity, the silos are having to find ways to reach out to each other, which is why the UN Migration Network is going to be so important, that all the people, all the voices should be there in some disciplined way. And we are looking forward to the IOM and the development community and everybody else, for the internationals, for the horsepower, intellectual horsepower needed to guide us through. Intellectual horsepower, that means the data, that means the macro economy and all this stuff. So that's one big chunk. The multilateral scene is changing because it has to. The institutions are changing because the world is changing, and it is a good thing. Second big one. For a country like the Philippines, of course our focal point has been remittances. We just became a lower middle income country. But as we progress, we will be looking more at value and skills and all these things that were mentioned by the guru of remittances. So what we want, basically, because it's complicated out there, you generate some kind of simple menu of options. But if you follow a country like the Philippines, the central philosophical focus is on greater self-empowered agency by migrants. We don't have a lot of migrant companies, etc. It's to expand the opportunities available to individual migrants and their families to send remittances home cheaper, to find a easier way to get their skills recognized. So if you need to, the evidence is necessary, but practical programs for helping individuals and families is desperately needed as well. So just those two. No? It's possible to get a bit too, abstract, big world, and forget that in the end you're talking about individual migrants and their families. And finally, of course, we have this mindset, sending, transit, receiving countries. That's the way it is because we have national boundaries. But among the things that you have to think about and help us think through is what is the real impact of globalization and transboundaryness? Okay, we're not borderless, but we can think in terms of transboundaryness and help us through that thicket. And I think we'll go places. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Evan, also for reminding how some of those issues look actually very different from the point of view of a country like the Philippines as opposed to some of donor countries or traditional communities. Both Dilip and Laura need to go. I wonder if each of you have one last thing to say. You don't have to, but Laura, if you have some final comments before we go. And then
I always have a last thing to say. I would say several comments. First of all, I think both Canada and the Philippines talk about breaking the silos, no? And I think that's the effort that we are all trying to do. And I think that the 2030 agenda gave us actually an excellent framework to do that. The Global Compact on Migration is an addition to that framework. And then if you put the two together, you have all the elements to really break the silos. Now, the communities are different, and we have to keep that in mind. And if we don't have the right people in the discussions, then we will continue to be, in a certain way, partial, or we will have to continue to have partial approaches to this. And you mentioned the role of DFID now, but governments have the same problem, no? We meet with governments, and then we meet the Ministry of Interior, and then we meet the Ministry of Labor, and then we meet the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and each one of them very often tell us different things. And often when because IOM has been promoting, because migration is cross-cutting, IOM has been promoting this whole of government approach. Very often when we have meetings, including in the UK, no? We see that officials of the different ministries, they are just meeting. They have never been dealing together with issues, and they don't know each other because they deal totally with different subjects. So bringing that holistic approach is not only a holistic approach of organizations, or the UN system, or the UN system with the banks and other entities, financial entities, or civil society, but it's also try to bring that into your own government. And it's the only way that we are going to be really successful in trying to break those silos, because then governments will have common positions that bring and put together the interest of all the entities within the government. And I think that is extremely important. Another comment is I think, yes, the world is changing, as Evan said, and certainly we are all changing. As I said, the fact that development has been included, IOM has been fighting for this in the last, I would say, 15 years. We got there, okay, but this is only the beginning, no? We have to make it happen. Now, there are a series of things that we are doing to try to promote that logic, and I'm hoping that, again, with the SDGs and with the Global Compact together, we are going to be able to do this more and more. Like this morning or early today, I was in an event with UNCTAD and UNHCR on a policy guide that we developed together on entrepreneurship of migrants and refugees. So this gives already a good basis for governments, but also for our own institutions to try to see how do we incorporate that logic into our own work. And it's not because, for example, in our case, we have people working on assisted voluntary return and reintegration. Well, these people are not experts on entrepreneurship. And they don't have that logic. So for us, it's extremely important to have this guide, this policy guide, and also to train our own people of the possibilities that exist and the connections that exist between our programs that are totally different and then these potential that migrants can bring and build that capacity within the organization. We just did an event yesterday about trade and migration. So how can we boost trade either in the countries of destination, but also on the countries of origin, and Pierre, no? Pierre was talking about investment and private investment, no? And how migrants bring those social connections and economic connections between with the skills that they develop in the countries of destination back to their countries of origin, even without returning, is amazing. And the linkages that they create, because one thing that we have seen very clearly is that migrants abroad are more willing to invest in their own countries of origin and take the risk because they know the people, they know the conditions, and they are not afraid of investing. Whereas sometimes people from the countries of destination, they are really afraid of investing because countries of origin like mine are a little bit more challenging. No? So those are the things that I think in the future is going to be much more, we have to work much more. There was a question about remittances, and I think there are extremely good examples of countries, particularly countries, developing countries, that have managed to, promote a more productive use of remittances by creating programs that make that use of remittances attractive to the migrants. Because as Dilip said, remittances are private money. But if you create some conditions, there are ways of let's say promoting the people to use it in a more productive way. I remember a very good program that existed in Mexico where the government, the local authorities, and the migrants put 1/3 each, and they created a business with the money. So the migrant only had to put 1/3. And then the government another 1/3, and the community another 1/3. So you see more and more how the things are going. We in IOM, we also looked at, for example, reintegration in the past or return in the past as a very individualized thing. Now we are looking at it in the community sense. So how can we build the community, the community's capacity also to absorb the people, but to retain the people? And then how do we can use that money to really bring back the people and create the conditions so that the local conditions so that they can invest or remain there. So there are a series of things. Just to conclude, recruitment fees certainly is one of the big problems. Is one of the big problems because it's a total abuse of people. Nobody should be working, paying for finding a job. Normally it's the other way around. No? I think there is a big movement today to try to prevent that, and we are certainly in IOM part of it. We have created 2 programs that I think are, and try to bring others into it. One is the international recruitment, the integrity recruitment international system that is called IRIS, and this is basically a system of self-compliance that people, that companies, recruitment companies engage into respecting some principles on doing the recruitment and a certification process that brings that. And we are hoping to launch this. It had been a multi-stakeholder, a big effort of trying to bring a variety of actors, particularly private sector actors, into and recruitment companies to really create that system, and that gives, and that one of the basic principles of the system is the employers pay, fees paid by the employer. So that is one element. We are also working a lot on another program, corporate responsibility for enterprises to stop slavery and trafficking. That is working more with the companies to look at their supply chain and ensure that there is no abuses, no exploitation, no trafficking in their supply chain, and building the capacity of those companies to do it. So I think, again, there is a lot that we can do. We are going to be working more with the banks, and indeed, I think it is a great momentum, not only for IOM, but I think it is a great momentum for the world to try to really bring the capacity of a lot of the people and the capital that a lot of the people that are moving around have, and that in a certain way we have misused up to now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you for staying with us up until now and for choosing us over the flagship for so much longer. And Cecile, if you want to also join the panel so that if there are other questions for you and later, you can take them. And Sonia Plaza has joined us now, also worked with Dilip at the bank, so if there are more questions at the bank later, we can take it. But let me now pick up where Laura's left with this encouragement to make the most of all the opportunities that exist, to turn to Michael Clemens, who is one of the 2 co-directors of the program at the Center for Global Development on on migration, displacement, and humanitarian issues. Michael has been the exception to everything I said earlier about the development community not doing enough on migration. A leading economist who's been studying and producing really invaluable evidence on a number of relationships between the reality of migration and development. But also increasingly, in particular in recent times, as the political landscape got as tough as it has become, a really vocal person and a voice out there calling out for what can and should be done. And in that spirit, Michael, throughout the negotiations of the compact, has been focusing on very concrete ideas where a lot of what we heard about this amazing enabling environment that we finally have, we can build on, called the Global Skills Partnership, which is now being heralded as one of the very few but very good pragmatic ideas we've got that we can experiment with as the compact gets underway. So Michael, over to you, and then we'll come back for a broader discussion with all of you.
I want to volunteer to cede my time to the audience. I mean, they've been sitting through many presentations and talking, and there are many experts in the room. There are lots of questions. Are you sure? Yeah, half an hour. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm grateful that you continue listening to all of this discussion, and I hope to be brief. Laura remarked on how far we've come since the Millennium Development Goals, and really, if you go back and read the roadmap to the Millennium Development Goals, it mentions migration twice. Once to say that rural-urban migration increases poverty in cities, and the other to say that international migration spreads epidemic disease. And that's it. There's no other mention of migration in the whole thing. And she was really right to say we've come a long way since then. She was wonderfully optimistic about how far we've come. I'm less optimistic when I see the creation of the really admirable work of the EU Emergency Trust Fund for Africa. I know many people who work on it. I admire it a lot, but it is premised on a very different idea than the inspirational one that Laura set forth. And it's fundamentally the idea that development and migration are opposites. Really in the development community that I spend most of my time in, they get stuck right at the title of that slide. Migration for development is not a phrase that makes any sense when you're talking about things that are antithetical to each other. The idea that more development in Africa will mean less migration, and also an undercurrent that more migration saps human resources and talent and energy from countries and leads to less development. I don't mock that view at all because I think it's perfectly reasonable. So if you look at Mo Ibrahim, a Sudanese billionaire who used to be, at one point when he was young, a mid-level functionary in the Sudan Telecoms office. And then he left to study in the UK and make businesses and go on to a great career. At the moment that he left, you could ask him, well, why are you leaving? And he'd say, well, for professional opportunity. And it would be reasonable to say if there were more opportunities in Sudan, then he wouldn't need to leave. That's perfectly reasonable. It would be also reasonable to look at his departure and say, no, here's a smart, energetic, dynamic person that Sudan's losing. And that could harm the long-term prospects of Sudan. So seeing these forces as contradictory to each other, something in opposition, I don't think is crazy at all. I think it misses a much bigger picture, and that is that over the broader development experience of countries, migration and development are so complementary to each other that I don't think it's meaningful to talk about the effect of one on the other. Migration is a part of the development process. That is, in the same way that you could ask, well, what's the effect of blood on the body? I mean, it's a logical question. Blood carries oxygen around, but in another sense, it's a meaningless question. Blood is part of the body. As the body grows, blood grows. Blood is a manifestation of the growth of the body. They're not separable from each other, as Dilip just eloquently put. And this is in two senses. One, that as poor countries develop, historically, migration typically and nearly always goes up. So I mean specifically, if you look at the economic development experience of every country on Earth from 1960 to 2013, and look at the 71 countries that ended up after that period at middle income or above, 67 of those, 67 of the 71 countries that successfully developed in the post-war period had a large rise in emigration. It wasn't that as they developed more, emigration went down and more people started staying home. You know, it's very complex why that is. It's something that's been true over all of history, I might add. Why did 20% of the Swedish population leave Sweden for good between 1880 and 1930? Not because that was the moment that Swedish development failed. It's exactly the opposite. That was the moment that Sweden was developing, was taking off to become a modern developed economy. And it's too long to go into the reasons, but one of the biggest ones is demographic. That is, why are there going to be 800 million new sub-Saharan African labor force participants by 2050 with the accompanying migration pressure? Is that because Africa's so poor, because Africa's failing? It's exactly the opposite. The reason all of those people are going to be around is that they didn't die as children. And I mean that very precisely. One of the biggest reasons for that demographic bulge is the fact that child mortality rates have been plummeting across Africa for decades. That migration pressure is a sign of development success in Africa. It is a manifestation of the fact that Africa is developing. And it is not at all a sign of failure. And in the other sense that you alluded to, Pierre, that the emigration that is caused by development comes back to cause more development. You talked about how social scientists have measured a technology transfer from immigrants back to the countries of origin by patent citations. Social scientists have also shown that countries with more low skill and high skill immigration have more investment coming home, have more trade coming home, and not just more trade, but more complex trade. One of the most interesting papers on this subject in economics by Hillel Rappaport and Danny Bahar shows that countries with more immigrants abroad, skilled and unskilled, tend to start producing categories of goods that they never produced before and exporting those goods. That is, the complexification of the economy, which is part and parcel of development, goes hand in hand with migration. It is not the opposite of migration. So just to sound a positive note, though, in getting to the global compacts, really the way we've talked about how migration is discussed in just radically different terms in the Sustainable Development Goals. The Global Compact is really constructive in this regard. It is not built around the idea that migration and development are opposites at all. And I'll just close with one specific way that the Compact manifests a much different and I think much more accurate and constructive view of the relationship between migration and development. That's the proposal of global skill partnerships in Objective 18. Global skill partnerships are a proposal for bilateral agreements between migrant sending countries and origin countries in which there's an exchange of fundamentally training for job placement. That is, countries of migrant origin agree to bundle vocational technical training for potential migrants and for non-migrants conducted in the country of origin, both of them, in exchange for the country of destination providing technology and finance for that training in the country of origin, as well as job placement in the destination. And it can be a mutually beneficial exchange. The country of destination gets more of what it wants out of migration. People who arrive with the skills, technical skills, language skills to immediately integrate and visibly contribute. Countries of origin don't get a drain. They can get a net increase of human capital and strengthened rather than weakened training institutions. It is the fact that the Compact builds in such a proposal as a way to implement the Compact shows that it just has a much more 21st century, much more advanced, much more nuanced understanding of the relationship between migration and development. And I highlight that one because I've been very interested in it for a long time, but there are many other parts of the Compact that just highlight how migration can be a tool for development, and in a more fundamental sense that that migration is a part of the development process that can be harnessed or impeded, but does not stand apart from it, and is certainly not its opposite.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much. And I think this gives a great opportunity now to listen to all of you, to get your comments, your questions. Let me just share one thought based on your observation of the compact being, a 21st century platform when it comes to finally getting to the nature of the relationship between migration and development. It has been a fascinating process to observe, because the reality of the difficult, the complex relationship and how intertwined it is, and the fact that has created over time, as Pierre said earlier, also some genuine confusion among professionals trying to understand, how to tackle it, something that, as you said, is so bundled together. And to observe during the negotiation, as you can imagine, there are limits to an international negotiated text, but to see emerge, if not crystal clear, but certainly a much better fit for purpose platform that actually handles that complexity without fear, so to speak, and presents also the some of the contradictions, but also some of the potential of those two things belonging to one another, and fundamentally bringing states, a different side of the negotiations, into some kind of common ground and understanding. The second is just an encouragement that the job is not done. SDGs were mentioned, and how much better it is to have now migration included in the SDGs, given how far we're coming from what Michael said about the MDGs. We need to go further. I mean, I've also seen the limits now, saying that being satisfied that migration is one target or 3 targets in the SDGs is clearly not enough, or we need to make the most of the SDGs in their holistic potential to really show how migration interacts with all development goals. It's something that my colleague Helen has done beautifully in the deck of cards that some of you have picked up outside, where she showed succinctly the multiple relationships. So that blood-body metaphor, really, how it works out in relation to different sectors beyond the specific target. And very finally, and then I'll hand over to you, what Dilip said about the fact that migration has been part of the knowledge function on the bank is now going to operation, I think is true more broadly. I think it's true to say that researchers, and I come from a research institute, have done a lot, and lots of papers have been written around this fascinating relationship, and is now, when it comes into operationalizing that synergies into things like the Global Skills Partnership, that it really comes alive, but also where some of the challenges inevitably come to the surface on how to do it, because nobody obviously has the final answer. A lot of it is being tried out in practice. So if Helen, you can help me with the microphone, we'll take a few questions, we'll come back to the panel at the end. There's a question here, please introduce yourself. And I'm sorry, it's only English because we don't have translators in this session.
Yeah, so Floor Didden from the Belgian NGO Coalition. Thank you for the interesting insights in the way that migration can contribute to the achievement of development goals, and also the positive framing of migration and the benefits of migration. I think this is very welcoming, and also if we read the Global Compact, it's very present, this vision. But my question is more where we do not see this positive framing, and the way that the benefits of migration, where we do not see this, is in public debates, I think, in political debates. As you might know, in Belgium, we had a big discussion over the Global Compact, and our government almost fell over it.
I thought it did, no?
But it's continuing. The Nationalist Party just left the government, and their ministers have now been replaced by other parties. But what we see in all these discussions is that even the parties and the politicians in defense of the Global Compact and the whole protecting of the Global Compact, all this is not framed in this way. When you read the text, it's framed in this will help us in returning migrants. We have to cooperate internationally to protect our borders. This is the way that even the people that are positive to the Global Compact in Belgium, and I'm sure this is the same in other EU countries, this is the way that they frame it. And the whole idea behind the Global Compact, and which is this idea, I think, of making migration work for everyone, this is, I think, totally absent in most public debates. And so my question to the panelists: how can we also get these discussions more on a more public and debate.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And as Michael noted earlier, there are a number of experts in the audience and a number that also may have good ideas on how to address this question. So how do we, how do we translate some of these insights in something that can genuinely contribute to the political debate? I'm looking at Gonzalo, but he's not is coming in yet. Do you want to say something about this? Gonzalo van Hoel has a wealth of experience in this domain.
Thank you.
Can you say who you are? Introduce.
Gonzalo van Hoel from Spain. There's a small NGO working with social researchers and journalists on how to influence the public debate on migration. My question is actually more for the government representatives and maybe for others in the... one of the things that I completely agree with Marta is that development agencies are most often nowhere to be seen in this debate, particularly when governments have to decide their positions, their migration policies. Interior ministers in the first place, and then labor maybe, have a preeminence. But I think that development agencies, first of all, have a different political voice, but also I think they have an experience in innovation, if we are talking about this, because of the nature of the development work, that could be extremely useful in improving the migration. My question is, how do we make this better? And I'm saying this while at the same time I'm complaining because the Spanish Development Agency, for instance, has not even sent a representative here, and I think that this is the case of many other agencies to this conference. Well, I know David is here, and that's why I'm asking them among others. No?
Okay, thank you. So we'll come back also to the member states. And on that, I thought we were listening to this debate about diaspora being private financing versus public financing. There is obviously a much broader debate around blended financing and ways on trying to maximize or catalyze, I think that's the word, private financing for public. For public goods, which is be useful to connect perhaps more broadly. A question here.
Yeah, thank you for a fantastic discussion. My name is Andrew Fuse. I work with Church World Service in New York, the U.S. And we are a faith-based organization that both serves migrants, particularly refugees, but also other migrants, and works in community-based development. And we ourselves are, I think, grappling and often feel like we're struggling to see how we can connect up these different parts of our work. So I think this has been a great panel for me to hear, to bring back some new ideas to our teams and see how we can improve that in-house exchange and brainstorming. In some of our community development settings in Central America, we've heard anecdotally of investments from diaspora groups in public goods or some sort of collective action around remittances and mobilizing resources that are going back towards something that might not be considered strictly an individual benefit back home. I'm curious whether this is something that you've seen elsewhere. Thanks.
Sonia will answer. More questions before Jason? Yes.
Yeah. So my name is Jason Gagnon. I'm from the OECD Development Center. First, thank you to the panelists for an excellent contribution to this debate. I just wanted to offer a few reflections based on our own work over the last few years. The first one is it's absolutely true that we've come a pretty long way in a short amount of time, considering how thinking on development since World War II basically has taken a very long time, and we've done this in more or less 20 years. But I recently was asked to give a presentation at the African Parliamentary Union in Niamey, and it was astounding to what extent parliamentarians in the room had never even thought about linking migration and development. And I had a lot of discussions after the presentation on how this can happen. And it was essentially, as you pointed out, Michael, it was either about development or about migration, and it was about the causal effect on the two, and not the fact that they were part and parcel of the same thing. But to go back to the work we've been doing over the last few years, I wanted to offer a bit of a different view on the holistic thinking. And a lot of this discussion, some of the panelists brought up, but Gonzalo just brought up as well, is focused on donors. The discussions that we've been having in developing countries has to do with the public policies that are being put in place in those countries. And it's essentially the same type of debate that we're having with the donors here, in that the migration policies are essentially focused around those that specifically have to do with migration, or those that specifically might have to do with, or not with those that specifically have to do with development. And it was very difficult for us to get those that have to do with, for instance, agricultural policy or labor market policy or education policy around the room to discuss about migration. Just to give a couple of examples on how that might be important, and it has to do with what Dilip said earlier about placing the conditions in place on maximizing the impact of remittances. Imagine that a system where there's very little social protection, and some of that money is being put aside to basically protect the household or to save for whatever instance. Suddenly you have a social protection system. That money being remitted to those households might be used differently in a more productive way. So there's inadvertent effects that you might imagine. And a lot of those effects, we visited 500 different communities across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and asked the community leaders how they were being implemented. And ironically, these are the communities where integration actually happens, or where emigration and public policies actually happen. And Cecilia could probably tell probably more about the local effects there. But none of these communities, the vast majority of these communities, felt that they weren't necessarily involved in the public policy process at the national level, or in any way capacity in the government, in the policy making in the country. And just a very last comment on what Michael ended on the mobility transition curve. I completely buy into the mobility transition curve, but I also buy into the fact that you can curb it. And I think public policies have a very important role in doing that. And you mentioned that no country has actually developed without that curve following itself going up. But there are countries that really shorten the amount of time that they reach that top. Costa Rica is a fascinating example of that, where the emigration rate was never really outstandingly high. And yet, I certainly believe that public policies, migration or non-migration, had a pretty direct effect on why that was. Thanks.
Thank you. Some more questions before I come back to the panel? Karen at the back. I know so many of you in the room. It's nice. And then Barbara.
Hi, Karen Hargrave from British Red Cross. So I thought it was really interesting to hear so much talk in the panel about sort of working across different communities and breaking down silos. And I think just to add one more to the mix, I think it's also interesting to think in the context of the Global Compact for migration about how we could also use this as an opportunity to break down the silos and work more coherently across humanitarian and development communities. I know that's something we don't always do very well, but I think migration presents an area where it's really important to get that right. I think that's, it's implicit in the points that were raised by the UK delegation about the link to protracted crisis. I think there's also a really important link between meeting migrants' humanitarian needs and their ability to contribute to societies and to development. So I think, the question there really is how can we break down one more silo with the humanitarian community as well?
Thank you, Karen. Evan needs to leave, so he wants us to have one comment, and then I'll go over to Barbara, and then maybe we'll come back to the panel. And there's anybody else who has a really important thing to say, put your hands up.
My apologies, I have to rush. But in the Philippines, we have recently mainstreamed migration and national development planning. But that was after we were asked to mainstream basic human needs, climate change, DRR. It takes a while, to domesticate these kinds of things. It's not just a question of writing it into your national plan. You really have to think things through. And the second point is the Philippines has a very large remittance inflow. And most of that is entirely private. It goes into housing. In the previous generation, economists didn't view investments in building houses as economic development. Well, now they do. So things are changing. The old guard is going away, and the new people are coming in. So just that, there's hope on the horizon. Thank you.
And yesterday, the mayors were discussing highly innovative ways of diaspora bonds to actually make the most of that private money in more developmental sense. So there are also experimentation going on. Barbara, I think, and then we'll come back to the panel for the last 10 minutes. I promise I won't take you more than 5 extra minutes than needed.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm Barbara Rambusek. I'm also from EBRD. Very quickly, just 2 points I wanted to raise because I don't think that has really come up. The first one is on the private sector as a major player in this context as well. I think we I think have recognized that this is the case, but I think what hasn't been recognized is the extent to which there is capacity building and is required, because in many cases private sector companies are quite keen to employ people with the right skills. They're looking for people with the right skills. Skills mismatch is a huge issue. So looking for talent and human capital is important, but they don't know how to go about that. So we are working very closely with our clients, and repeatedly we find that in principle they'd be quite happy to employ refugees, to employ migrants. They don't really care, but they don't know how to go about that in a way that is formal, that is legal, that is in line with national regulations, and that is a very opaque field for them, and one area where I think that bridge needs to be built between the private sector, between policymakers. And the second point I wanted to raise was on other trends, when we look at employment and skills, etc., in particular in relation to the future of work. So I was wondering to what extent you'd been looking at, particularly looking at Michael Clemens here, when you look at the skills and this sort of circular migration on skills, have you looked at technology and lifelong learning and how technology could impact the type of skills that are required and how also skills could be transmitted, how teaching and education can actually happen, reach out maybe to more remote communities, to different types of groups. So I think that would be a very interesting way. And then the second also, what type of jobs, what is a job, what is employment? All these things are changing. So how does that link up with migration flows and development in this context?
Thank you, Barbara. So let me get back first to the two remaining member states, as Evan from the Philippines has left, partly because there were also specific questions also for development agencies that we have here from Canada and from the UK. And I wonder whether you might also want to pick up some of the broader questions about political narratives, given that in some of these donor countries, obviously there is an additional political narrative angle around the use of aid to mitigate or to stem or to stop irregular migration altogether, which might come in the way of some of these attempts to inform a better public debate. Dave, did you want to go first?
Sure, I'll launch off. It's a great conversation, I think. One point I'll try to make 4 quick points. One is the importance of political leadership, and that gets at the question. I think so, but at all levels. So not just at the federal level, but the provincial level or municipal level. Our mayor from Montreal is speaking here, the civil society level, but political level at the highest for all countries. And so that speaks to both the counter narrative, if you like, but in order to have the policies in place to be driving that forward and breaking down the silos, that was point well taken within bureaucracies as well. Evidence and data, it's critical. Our minister at the last panel, our minister for migration, citizenship, and refugees said, you can fight fear with facts. So being able to speak to, it's not the only thing, but being able to point to the economic benefits, the degrees of integration, the entrepreneurship that we see, the fact that most migration is regular, those facts that get lost in some of the political debate. Thirdly, the need for the whole of society, so these frontline organizations, and to make the bridges to development. With the SDGs, a lot of our domestic organizations, the hundreds that work across Canada in helping refugees integrate into Canada, are now thinking about those crosswalks to the international side with the universal aspects of the SDGs. And maybe I'll just lastly say, for anyone who's doubting about the role of migration in development is looking through a gender-sensitive lens. For women, migration can be a road to a new job, a new opportunity to empowerment, a new life, and so we need to be looking at our policies through a gender-sensitive lens.
Thank you. Paul?
Thank you. Just on this point about development and domestic policies and how development agencies, I think one thing that's been a real eye-opener, thanks to the Compact, has been that for the first time, really, the development bit of the UK government has sat at the same table as the Interior Ministry and the Foreign Ministry, and it has forced us to talk together in a way that we wouldn't normally do, to understand policies on some of the sort of sharper ends of the Compact, things like child detention, and what is our line on child detention, and what is the... So I don't know where that's going to lead, clearly the challenge will be to stay joined up in that way. Certainly, we as the Development Agency try to influence the UK's migration policy domestically by giving it a greater focus, for example, on lower skilled works and visas for lower skilled workers. That is work in progress, but I think there are opportunities. On the narrative point, we have had a fairly defensive narrative, frankly, about the Compact and about migration, in partly because we've had to defend certain points against fairly hostile attacks. There are some very positive bits of the narrative which, there's a decision to be made about, do we get on the front foot? The UK, what we haven't really been able to shout from the rafters is the UK is the 5th biggest migration country in terms of receiving migrants in the world by total numbers. We also have the 9th largest diaspora in the world. Speaks to your point, Michael, that development and migration go hand in hand. We're typical of other developed economies, that we have a large migration community inside the country and we have a large diaspora, so they are of course linked. And I suppose where I see hope for all the negative narrative is an example in the UK that you're probably familiar with, which is around the so-called Windrush generation of migrants who came in from the Caribbean back in the 50s, the first wave. And when it was found that many had been poorly treated by the state and had had their visas revoked because of this so-called hostile environment, it led to a big public outcry, genuine cross-community outcry, and it led to a cabinet minister resigning. And so that I think there is a community, our society wants to treat people well, and so we have to tap into that. I think the key, finally, will be just reaching into those bits of society, and our society in particular, who feel threatened and who are at the moment most vulnerable to these negative narratives. That's the real challenge, I think.
Thank you, Paul. Let me come to the panel. We are running a little bit out of time, but we also started a bit late, so if we can have 5 extra minutes, that would be great. Not a problem if we need to stop recording. I just want to make sure we get to the bottom of this interesting discussion. Sonia, briefly, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Sonia Plaza. I'm from the World Bank, and I wanted to bring 4 points, okay, very quickly. I'm very glad that Michael said what I was going to say, because if you were sitting with me, with my African friends, the Latin American, everybody, and this when I'm sitting in this conversation with my friends, they will say, what they're talking? Development and migration for us is the same thing in the sense. There's no difference, because when we look everything from the development. So my second point is, Laura was mentioned about this 3x1 in Mexico. We are the bank. We were doing that, not like a migration project, not like 3x1. We were doing local, regional development, okay? I was in Chiapas, I was in Zacatecas when this was created, and we were looking at how we develop the local community, and they say, oh yeah, the diaspora wanted to do, but this was a local development. Developing countries have been working on migration for a long time. You were mentioned the Asian countries. In the East Asian Miracle, when we produced the first report, it was transfer of technology. Korea, the Taiwans, the Chinese, and for us, that was part of the development. You will see very clear the immigration and the transfer of technology. So it's a very interesting debate because all of us coming from a different theme, but I wanted to bring you also to think from the point of view of the developing countries, how we were thinking and approaching. And if you talk to African countries, they say, but we cross, we are the same, okay? It's all the time we're crossing, so we have this barrier. Go to Chiapas, Guatemaltecas and Chiapas are the same, no, we're crossing. We have created a problem now. Since 2008, they put the barriers, now they cannot cross, and you have all these irregularities. Before they were crossing every 24 hours. Now, concrete examples on the World Bank, okay? We talk knowledge examples. Somalia, what we're doing in Somalia, you were mentioning we're not doing something concrete. We are doing something that is in the Global Compact, IDs. We are doing ID 4D a lot, digital economy, how they can bring more remittances and how we can do the anti-money laundering. Women entrepreneurs, you were mentioning about gender. We are looking at SME financing, how we can mobilize the woman entrepreneur. I did a diaspora of the Somalia woman in Kenya, and and who are the most entrepreneurs in Dubai. A lot of the women bringing a lot of trade investment in Somalia. We are doing a lot on export zone processing in Jordan and Lebanon, and then we have the compact in Ethiopia. This is from the refugee side. From the migration side, we have migration development perspective, migration-driven development, diaspora bonds. So yes, we have to develop products. I leave you for 3 products for the people: value chain analysis, livestock insurance, microinsurance, and insurance for migrants.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, I just need to show. Do you have a comment?
Yeah, sorry, because we're literally being kicked out of the room. No, I just wanted to say one thing more than saying, actually showing you one thing, which is this guide that you can find at the back of the room, which is basically an analysis of how migration cuts across all the SDGs, and basically also offering concrete steps about how to translate that in policy making, both at the national as well as at the local level. And it is actually also exemplified through case studies. So I really hope you will use this tool in your daily work, because it is really about bringing everything we've been discussing together.
Okay. Yeah, sorry. And Michael, I just want one final word from all of you. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. No, but I don't want to hamper our friends to have enough time. On the narrative, I think just, obviously, there is a huge responsibility in the collective work we can do with donors and member states, because it's there, I think, that the keys lies. The responsibility also is in the hands of private companies. And I think what private entrepreneurs, private companies can say on migration can have a decisive impact, by the way, on an issue which, when you look at the time devoted to the different issues by leaders at the European level in the Council, European Council, there are only 2 subjects which gather 90% of the time heads of state took in the last year. It's migration, especially border control, and Brexit. And probably Brexit, at least the role of private companies on Brexit, is also a question which has that in common.